This is a painting by Caravaggio, the Italian painter Caravaggio, and it is made in 1601 or 1602, around that time. And it shows us Christ with two followers sitting in a tavern, and it is after his crucifixion. And these two followers were traveling to Emmaus, and they met a stranger, and that stranger walked with them, and they didn't recognize Christ immediately. But at the moment that they were having dinner, he started to bless the bread, and which we see here. And that's the moment that they recognize Christ. And Caravaggio made a very explosive scene of this one. There's another version, a later version, and that's more muted, more calm. They respond very differently in that version. But in this version you get this very explosive reaction to what they experience. There's this one moment that they recognize him, and all of a sudden I would say hell breaks loose, but that's very inappropriate. But they have the surprise of their lives. When I look at this painting, I get the feeling that this servant of the tavern where they are sitting, eating, who doesn't know what's happening here, he's the one I can most identify with. You know, he's looking at them, and these three people are emotionally invested in a sort of scene, in very important happening in their lives. And he is watching it and tries to understand perhaps what's happening at that table. When I look at this painting, I can see that Caravaggio has a very linear style. You could almost cut out every single object on the table. Everything is very clearly defined. And he's very observant for lighting. Here the tablecloth seems mirrored in this bowl. And for example, you can see here in this jar, this glass jar, how the lighting source is reflected. And he uses a small window, I think, with a quite strong light. And because the light source is quite small, the shadows are clearly defined. The edges of shadows are soft, but not very soft. They are still clearly defined. If you would have had a large window, then the shadows would be much softer on the edges. It's interesting to see how he is inspired by other works of art. This figure on the right, he seems to be inspired by the figure sitting on the right of Christ at the Last Supper of Leonardo da Vinci, with his hands wide. And Christ itself, who has a very feminine appearance with no beard. His gestures seem to be inspired by the Christ that we see at the Last Supper by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. And I think that this table motif seems to be inspired by the Last Supper scenes of the Renaissance, and perhaps especially the Leonardo version. Although this figure could be inspired by the way that Judas was positioned at earlier Last Supper versions, but it's hard to tell exactly where this comes from, but it seems to me that this is inspired by Last Supper versions, and because he already took something from Leonardo, it's easy to think that he might be inspired by that as well for that. Here we see a basket with fruit. It's very well possible that this fruit cannot be in this state at the same time of year. I'm not totally sure, but when you look at this basket of fruit, you see that it's on the edge of the table. And when you look at how much fruit there is in this basket, it's very easy to imagine that it will fall down. So with this explosive scene, it heightens the tension of this scene to have such a fragile balance with the way this is positioned here. So I think that he did that deliberately for that effect. Caravaggio was very influential. He arranges everything as if it is a stage, as a theater stage. So these are like theater players. And the light comes from a light source that we saw here from the left, from a high light source. And you can see how the face of Christ is being lit. And you get these sharp... I said that the shadows were soft, with soft edges, but I find these shadows relatively sharp compared to what other painters did, because he uses a small light source and these shadows are clearly defined, and I find that this shadow here at the back wall heightens the drama. So I think this is the shadow of this person, and it heightens the drama of this scene to get such a dramatic shadow here. And there's a difference between the kind of Clair-obscur, as it's called, extreme light and dark effect of, let's say, Caravaggio and let's say Rembrandt. When you look at Rembrandt's use of light and shadow, he seems to build up his light and shadows with parts that are a bit in the neighborhood of each other in regard to tonal value. With that I mean, when you look at, for example, a painting like The Night Watch by Rembrandt, and you look at certain areas, then you can see that next to a very light part, there is another part which is not as light as that part, but it's not as dark as what Caravaggio did. When you look at these areas, it's all very light against very dark. In many instances, like this face, this hand, this sleeve here, this white part of his clothing, or what is it? And Rembrandt has a tendency to build it up more from dark to light. There's a certain careful arrangement. So it's a little bit like it's more smoky in Rembrandt's case. There are a few details that I found very interesting in their lighting. When I look at this hand, for example, it seems that this hand is mainly in the shadows, and it is lit by the reflection of this red piece of clothing here, I guess. And there is this reflected light from the tablecloth, so this hand is lit from below. So you get this warmer light here, and here this is a bit cooler. And by means of reflected light, he knows how to define this hand, which I find very beautifully done. And I find this hand also beautifully lit. There's this small area which catches some light, but not much. And here you see just a little bit of lighting. I find this a beautiful detail. And the face of this man is also defined by means of reflected light. So I'm not totally sure if this actually is correct. I mean, the light comes from the left, so the table reflects light, so his face is being lit from this side, from the reflected light, by the reflected light of the tablecloth, mostly I think, his face is being lit. And the use of reflected light was a development. In the early 16th century, they didn't really know how to deal with reflected light. And later on, Caravaggio knew how to use it. And you see here that the face of Christ is also defined by means of reflected light. And you have someone like Jan van Eyck who does this too in the Arnolfini wedding. You see also that someone's face is defined by reflected light. And maybe in the Renaissance they could do this, but what they developed in the Baroque was that they could have large parts of compositions in the shadows. For example, a cityscape in which buildings are for a great part in the shadows, and they could define these parts in the shadows by means of reflected light, and that was a 17th century development for the most part. But we see here that this face is also being defined by reflected light, so there was this development of Raphael didn't know how to use it properly, and someone like Caravaggio seems to know it quite well. And this process of development is being told by Gerard Tilleres talks about this development in his book about painting. But I really like the way Caravaggio uses reflected light to define especially this hand and this face. Not really this hand perhaps, but especially these details. Caravaggio in the National Gallery in London.